you know what's unfair? What is fairness? I stumbled. I don't know. And I couldn't glimpse into the vast oceanic knowledge of his. And then I asked, please enlighten me. And then he whispered, Oz, 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 to my ear, the end is here. And then I spent a long time last night to think, what did he mean? But then I had this epiphany that Oz actually means optimistic social sequencing. And that is what I'm going to talk to you today, to spread the gospel of the kaiju, of the Cthulhu, the ultimate ordering protocol. And yeah, so I'm basically going to roast all of the ordering protocol designs and finally come to the Cthulhu's enlightenment. First, fair ordering by randomness. What if your destiny, your fate is designed by God? Does God play dice? We don't know, but that sounds fair, right? So as many of you here probably know, that fair ordering by randomness encourages spam, and spam causes network congestion, which in turn causes high fees. And that is a clear negative externality of MEV on this kind of random fair ordering chains. So what about fair ordering by the majority receive order, which is the OG fairness notion? And so this quickly turns into a latency game, which causes collusion and centralization, and therefore, vertical integration between validators and searchers. If you take the hood off the validator, you will see, under the hood, they are actually MEV searchers, most of them. So boom, roasted. Fair ordering by commit review. What if we cryptographically encode all the transactions, and then after their mind, we reveal what they are? So as we all know, commit review schemes require person to decode the transaction, and the person who decodes the transaction have a more probabilistic advantage at backgrounding the revealed transactions than others. So naturally, this also causes collusion and centralization between the cryptographic key keepers and the actual searchers. So boom, roasted. Fair ordering by being ad hoc. What if fair ordering doesn't work for general computation, but then can we actually have a fair ordering for application-specific chains? So this is basically saying, what if we assume we have more assumptions for the players? So studies have shown that Uniswap liquidity providers, or generally any AMM liquidity providers, loses the most MEV because they just post their orders that are waiting to be sniped. So they are the biggest losers. But then who are the biggest winners? In this, just last year, August to October, you can see that all of the Flashbots bundles, the number picked as the bundles that paid more than 95% of the total MEV extracted to validators. So naturally, validators are in a privileged position. They control block space, so they are the biggest winners of MEV. So the idea of this is that what if we make the biggest losers also the biggest winners? This idea corresponds to requiring that you have a liquidity provider LP token in order to stake in the network and become a validator. So in this way, MEV is kind of conserved. But of course, this creates a market of lemon situation where there's adverse selection. The players not necessarily have incentive aligned. So roasted. Fair ordering by burning. This corresponds to, so this idea is basically I take all the MEV and then I burn it so that all the base consensus layer token holders gets a fair share of their MEV. This corresponds to having a universal basic income for every ETH holder, right? But of course, this creates the same problem that it is not incentive aligned, because what if a user gets sandwiched, the user loses the MEV, but then all the MEV goes to still, the person who holds ETH, but the user not necessarily holds ETH. So this also inherently favors, big holders, which are just whales. So roasting. Fair ordering by maximum efficiency. of course, this is the argument saying that by extracting the most MEV, I'm actually, so this is the argument used by hackers, right? By hacking you, I have warned everybody that this is hackable, and thus you will be able to better defend this. We all know where this is leading to, a predatory behavior on-chain. But of course, this philosophically, I think, aligns with effective altruism on-chain. And we know all those crypto billionaires, FTX, SBF, no, no offense, it's gonna do to us. And yeah, then what if we make fair ordering by making the cost of extraction always greater than MEV? You hear all those people say that MEV is a trust assumption model problem, right? We should all assume everybody to be rational, instead assuming some people are honest and some people are malicious. So under all rational model assumption, if we always make the cost of extraction to grow super linearly to the MEV that is extractable on this chain, then all rational actors wouldn't extract MEV, right? This sounds very good. Then the problem with this is that this is kind of essentially the same as making everybody's life harder so that they are not in a mood to extract MEV, which isn't a very good solution. But of course, that's arguable. But so roasted. Fair ordering by social norms. This is Garen Gensler. He's the chairman of the FCC. What if he says, everybody who extracts MEV, we're going to call FBI, come here and waterboard you? Right? Then nobody would dare to extract the MEV. But the problem with this is, of course, we are back in the old days. Roasted. What if we have fair ordering by centralization and enshrined-ness? So suppose we have a Uniswap protocol or any AMM that is enshrined into the Ethereum consensus layer. And then we say that we encode a public key that's in that AMM contract. And we say only the person who holds the private key to this public key can extract MEV. In this way, there is no negative externality except for centralization, right? Because there won't be spam, there won't be any latency wars. But of course, the two problems with this is that first, it creates a central point of failure in the sense that there is only one actor, and second is that because there is no competition, capital is inefficient, the extraction is inefficient. So that the chains who have this enshrined-ness wouldn't be able to compete with other chains. Their MEV would be cannibalized by other more efficient MEV extractors. So what if? So by now, you guys have, you humans must have all figured out that MEV is ultimately an overlapping of user preferences, and typically this preference is how prioritized their transactions are in the block space. But then you come to this realization that all block builders are actually people who aggregate all users' transaction preferences and produce maximally efficient, utilitarianly best ordering in that block, right? So what if we produce this thing? Take a utilitarian approach, maximum happiness for the maximum amount of people. But of course, this faces the trolley problem. Who is to say that the transaction preference of 5 people is greater than the transaction preference of 1 people, right? So that there are a lot of nuances in this. So what if, when you see the word fair is usually related to equality. And what if we have this equality of outcome fair ordering, which is basically to say we favor the commons. So the idea of this chain would be I have everybody, either have a social score, every address has a social score, and the probability of me prioritizing the transaction preference of a less privileged people is greater than the probability of I prioritizing the transaction preference of a more privileged people. Right? This actually makes sense because it reduces the Gini coefficient and thus make everybody have an equality of outcome. But of course, this corresponds to taxes, kind of like taxes. And as many of you have dealt with IRS, it isn't a very pleasant experience. And of course, there are lots of problems with that. So what if we have this equality of opportunity, corresponding to the equality of outcome? We have this opportunity that people who contribute more actually get more rewards. Then the problem with this is that imagine a freedom monster. Let's imagine a monster now without a capacity for joy, but a capacity of devious cunning, and he always knows how to make trades at an advantage. Then this freedom monster, in the end, is going to accumulate all the MEV and become a super centralized validator and MEV extractor, and thus that is very detrimental to the security of our chain. And in reality, this freedom monster is called megafunds. So what if we have fair ordering by retroactive public goods funding? We extract all the MEV and we put this MEV into a public goods funding to actually kind of, tax all the criminal activities, and then use the tax to build infrastructures that everybody uses, build railroads, things like that. But of course, as all governments, there is a human element in this public goods funding process. And as you can see here, we have the devil Tom and the angel Jerry in every one of us. So it's inherently, have some certain flaws that cannot be dealt with. Then what if we have fair ordering by governance, that actually, people vote and choose, the person with the least devil and the most angel, right? Then, of course, this leads to a problem of benevolent dictatorship. The person on the left is the also the authoritarian dictator of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, and he, arguably under his dictatorship, under his governance, under his governance, the Singaporean people, on a utilitarian view, has more happiness than before, right? But of course, that is one problem with governance. The second problem is with this Wittgenstein, the person on the right that you see here, because on-chain governance is usually encoding our philosophy of what fair is, what morality is, into an on-chain smart contract, and that smart contract is a computer function, right? It is a formal system. And the problem with formal systems, as many of you might know, is that it has paradoxes. And traditionally, researchers have seen that, as long as a formal system is consistent, it is acceptable. But consistent isn't the only element. We need to look at more properties. But that is a super underdeveloped area. So, governance, fair ordering by governance is also roasted. Then what if we have fair ordering by governance and dynamic pricing? Say that we don't encode the rules into a smart contract. We actually use a dynamic pricing. We say that everybody express their transaction preferences by a bid, by a monetary value we put on it. And then we run an auction for it. This is essentially what Flashbots as it is today. But Flashbots is also not without our problems, right? So who is to say that everybody wants their preferences to be expressed in a monetary value, in a dollar sign, right? So here, we are coming to the conclusion, coming to my epiphany after talking with the kaiju, is that is there an actual fair ordering that we can do? Drum roll, please. Optimistic social sequencing, I present to you the ultimate ordering protocol, or OZ, as the kaiju told me. So OZ composed of this first element of a sequence verification program, which is a smart contract on layer 1 or any modular layer, right? Modular blockchain is pretty popular these days. Like a specialized layer that's just for sequencing. And this sequence verification program is a proxy contract that is upgradable by the governance. And the governance decides what kind of fairness, what kind of sequencing specifications they want the actual sequence to adhere to. And then we have this program, and there's a contract. And then suppose we are working on layer on layer 2 on a rollup. Then the layer 2 sequencer sequences a batch, and then makes the batch sequence data available in the DA layer. And then after that, the sequencer n+1 will optimistically assume that the sequencer n already produced a fair ordering, and that that notion of fair is whichever ordering that adheres to the specification that is written in the sequence verification program determined by governance. And then meanwhile, just as sequencer n+1 is sequencing the next batch, people will run fraud provers off-chain to check the sequencing's correctness, namely the sequencing of sequencer n. And if they found an unfair sequencing, they will send a fraud proof, and then the L1 sequencing verification contract will check and slashes the dishonest sequencers. Right? So on paper, this seems to work. The pros of this is that ours is social in the sense that we have the frequent but not too frequent ordering updates. And this solves the governance issues. And also, since this ordering, this specification that sequence must adhere to is determined by governance, then we can finally say that this sequence ordering protocol is actually fair. And other pros include the sequencing program is modular, and the notion of fairness, the notion of morality that everybody agrees on is upgradable. And some technical things is like this has lower latency because this is optimistic. So let's take a look at an example. What if we want to do the OG fairness to run the same ordering as the Aquitas protocol, which is the original fairness on ZK rollups? So in this situation, the sequencers will make their receive order data available, and we can add extra requirements. Say if it's not available in a short time, then we slash the sequencer or something like that. But after they do that, the provers who generate the ZK proofs will optimistically accept the sequencing and generate the proofs. And meanwhile, the clients off-chain checks the correctness of the sequencing, the fairness of the sequencing. And if a fraud proof is found, they submit that fraud proof to an on-chain verifier contract. And if it verifies, the auth fraud prover will slash the sequencer. Another example is a more dystopian one, a far-fetched one is for competent searchers. So suppose that the governance decides that we all want to pro-MEV extraction. We want to extract a lot of value from the sequencing. Then they might write a sequence verification contract that is a minimalistic searcher, an easy on-chain searcher that checks for sandwiches, arbitrages, and then just reorder things. And then they would require that the MEV extracted in the actual sequence provided by the sequencer is greater than the minimalistic on-chain in-contract searcher determined by the governance. In human words, this means that the governance has decided that the block builder has to be competent. The MEV searcher has to be competent in its MEV extraction. So some use cases of this could be that, hey, I want to donate $1 million to charity every day. And where does that money come from? I want it to come from MEV. So then I write this contract saying that, hey, in every batch sequencing, I require that the MEV extracted is greater than 1 ETH. And if it's not, I fire you. Then basically the sequencer gets slashed. Or some more dystopian example could be, a performance evaluation for MEV traders. That if the trader is incompetent, he gets slashed. He or she gets slashed. So with all those examples, with the epiphany, with the gospel of the Cthulhu, you have, it has brought us to the final takeaway. So MEV is created if there is an overlap of user preferences. There is no good or bad MEV. MEV is just created if there is an overlap. And people have overlaps all the time. It's hard to say whose preference is good, whose preference is bad. The trolley problem. And the second takeaway is that whoever is in the position to allocate resources to overlapping preferences is an MEV searcher or a block builder. And that leads us to 3. MEV is a governance problem just the same as it is a security problem, which means that the future is multi-domain with MEV conservation between each chain. So just as governance are self-assembled, people with similar ideologies form a government. And the future may be a domain that the auth sequence verification contract is determined by people with similar preferences for their smart contract, for their transaction ordering. And why MEV conservation between each domain is because if we don't have MEV conservation, then people who have less MEV extraction, people with fair ordering preferences would be cannibalized or like have their chain be extracted more MEV by people who actually believe in effective altruism or some bullshit like that, right? And then the fourth point and the most important one is that MEV is governance complete, meaning that the problem of MEV is actually as hard as at least as hard as the problem of building a good government, building a good governance mechanism. And maybe all blockchain problems are governance complete in the end. And the fifth problem, what we can do, right? How can we contribute? Governance is hard, and using formal systems to describe, to encode our governance preferences, our collective notion of what fair is into a smart contract is very dangerous. And then the best way that we can do is to make governance researchers' jobs easier. So I'm a MEV. So by this point, I'm an MEV researcher. My job, my job is done by us. Cthulhu has spoken that I don't need to work on this anymore. It's a governance researcher's job now. It's if there is anybody working on DAOs, that's your problem. And one example of this effort is, of course, Oz, as the Kaiju said, optimistic social sequencing rules. Yeah, and that's all.